Well, good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome. This is Valley Beth Shalom live and online. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, joined this morning by my dear friend Rabbi Marc Gellman, and this is Shabbos morning Torah study. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, my dear friend.
Very exciting week we've just had.
I would say
I'm sure there's lots of reflections, but I think what we're going to do is offer our friends a wonderful respite from the constant politics about us and spend a little time with some classic Torah. This morning we read from Parshat Vayera, which is the fourth Torah portion in the book of Genesis. And this Parsha is remarkable because this is the Parsha in which we really get a sense of who Abraham is and the dynamics of what it means to be a covenanted person, a covenantal relationship. And there are two narratives in this Torah portion which are so remarkable. They're so fundamental for Jewish religious life, in fact, all Western religious life. And we're going to try to spend a little time with each of them and try to understand the religious universe that these two narratives paint for us, the universe that the narrative invites us in. So in the beginning of the Torah portion, Vayera, three travelers are traipsing past Abraham's tent in southern Israel, and he invites them in, not knowing that they're angels, makes them a lovely meal, and over dinner, they inform him that they are angels, and they've come with messages. An angel in the Bible is a messenger. The first of the messengers says, "Mazel tov, you're going to be parents. Get ready," and of course, this sends Sarah, Abraham's wife, into hysterics because she's into her 90th year. He's 100. Viagra is still some 4,000 years away. And God says, "Why are you laughing?" And she says, "I'm not laughing." And God says, "You don't think I can do this? Watch." Zoom. And she becomes a mother. And that angel disappears. And then the narrative shifts. Because the narrative of Abraham is interesting, just structurally, that it shifts back and forth between the issue of family and progeny and their own personal futures, and the issues, the great religious issues that Abraham is sent to deal with, the great geopolitical issues and moral issues. And now we approach the next story, which is this remarkable tale. The tale is the story of the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. So remember, Abraham lives in Hebron, Kiryat Arba, which is just on the edge of the rift. And he looks down and there's the beautiful city of Sodom. And here's the narrative in Genesis 18. The men set out from there looking down towards Sodom, Abraham walking with them. Verse 17. Now the Lord had said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm going to do?" Now the ostensible answer to that question is clear. Of course you should hide from Abraham. What are you going to do? You're God. You don't have to tell everybody what you want to do. You're not accountable. Except having invited Abraham into a partnership, into covenant, that's exactly the point of the narrative. God has become accountable. Since Abraham has become a great and populous nation, the nations of the earth are blessed themselves by him. I've singled him out that he may do what is just and right. If Abraham is the ambassador of divine justice and righteousness in the world, Abraham has a right or a prerogative to know what the divine plan is. So God says, "I'm going to go take a look." And while he never tells him directly, "I'm going to destroy the city," Abraham intuits that's what's at stake here. And even though he has no relationship with this city, we'll find out later that his nephew lives there, but there's no relationship with these people. There's something that awakens in Abraham. And this awakening of moral conscience in Abraham is the revolution that the Bible is pointing toward. So here, verse 23, here is the soliloquy. It's one of the great speeches in the Bible. Abraham comes forward. The Hebrew is Vayigash Avraham. He steps into the fray. He steps into the encounter with the divine. And he says this, "Will you sweep away the innocent with the guilty?" Will you sweep away the innocent with the guilty? It's an open question. But it's a question with an edge to it. Because the question is, if we're going to do justice in the world, what does that justice look like? What if there be 50 innocent in the city? Will you then wipe out the place and not forgive it for the sake of the 50? And then here's the zinger. "Far be it from you to do such a thing." Now the Hebrew is chalila lecha, which doesn't mean "far be it from you." That was what Professor Ginsburg, translated that, because Professor Ginsburg was a very gentle man. But Chalila Lecha is what my bubby used to scream at me when I would beat up my brothers, you know? It's much closer to the Yiddish Shanda and a Cherpa. Like, I'm disappointed in you. Like, I'm ashamed of you. Like, how could you do this? This is Abraham dressing down God the way that one dresses down a kid who's just done something wrong. Chalila lecha, God forbid, shame on you for doing it, to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent and the guilty. Now that too is also way too literary. The Hebrew is lahamit tzadikim rasha. 3 words, 4 words. Lahamit, to kill, tzadik im rasha, innocent and guilty. To kill the innocent and guilty indiscriminately. And now the next line is v'haya katzadik karasha. And so it would be that innocent and guilty fare alike. Katzadik karasha literally means the guilty and the innocent are like one another. Is that the world you wanted, God? A world with no moral differentiation? A world with no right and wrong? A world with no separation between guilt and innocence? No differentiation? Far be it from you. It repeats that phrase, Chalila lecha, and then the ending phrase, shall not the judge of all the earth do justice? Now, here's the reason why I'm Jewish. Look at the next line. Now, what should happen at this point, of course, is God should get very upset and smush him like a bug. Because, like, who needs this? I mean, like, who needs this loudmouth Jew telling him how to run the universe, right? But God recognizes something in Abraham's argument and welcomes the rebuke. And that's the remarkable picture of this relationship. God says, okay, you're right. Give me 50, I'll give you the city. Give me 50, I'll give you the city. Right? And then Abraham, of course, is now going to have some fun with this because he sold enough camels in the shuk of Beersheba to know when you got a live one in a shop. So he says, okay, I venture to speak. I'm who, what, dust and ashes? What if the 50 lack 5? I mean, if you said you'd save the city for 50, you'll certainly save it for 5. Okay, what if I get 45? God says 45. Abraham says, what about 40? He says, I'll take 40. What about 30? I'll take 30. He knows how to run an auction. What about 20? I'll take 20. What about 10? Okay, 10, but that's it. And sold to the God of the universe for 10. It's an absurd story. It's an absurd narrative, this back and forth, this handling, as if you were buying a sheshbesh board in the shuk, you know. But what we get here is the following, is a God who is willing to enter into moral debate with a human being, and much more importantly, a human being who brings to his encounter with God, who brings to his spiritual life an independent sense of justice. An independent sense of justice. It's not that Abraham learned justice from God. It's that Abraham carries a sense of justice and then confronts God and says, you know justice and I know justice. We share a moral language. You can't do this. And that image, the Bible called it chutzpah, or the Talmud rather, called it chutzpah klapei shamaya, heavenly chutzpah. That's what makes Abraham unique. And that's what makes this religious universe unique. Now, I see you're making a face, so tell me what.
I love the whole thing. I love the handling. I love the whole thing. I just push back on one point, and that is Abraham is able to do this because he isn't Noah. And he isn't Noah, who didn't argue one peep when God says, I'm going to destroy the whole world. And Noah says, okay. Nothing. And the reason Abraham's able to argue for Sodom and Gomorrah, and Noah doesn't argue on behalf of the entire world, is because Abraham knows something about God that Noah didn't know. And that was the covenant with Noah after the flood, in which God says, seed time and harvest, summer and winter shall never cease again. I will never destroy the world with the flood again. And so what Abraham knows is that God is a God of justice. Noah only knew that God was a God of caprice, of whatever he decides to do, he's powerful enough to do. I'm scared of him. I can't say anything about him. He's an absolute ruler. There's nothing, I'm not even a participant in this drama. This is God with 100% of the chips. But Abraham knows that God has established after the flood a principle of justice. And so Abraham did know justice from God. He knew it from the covenant with Noah after the flood. And he is brilliantly appealing to God based on what he learned from Noah, that the innocent and the wicked should not share the same fate, which, of course, they did in the flood. And therefore, that's the difference. Now, there are several issues that still, for me, in the story, still are unresolved. If you have so much chutzpah, why do you end with 10? And I don't think God intended Abraham to end with 10. I think God would have gone lower. And the proof is that God, in fact, didn't destroy Lot and his family and saved them from Sodom and Gomorrah, even though in the deal that Abraham worked out with God, it would have been completely just if God had destroyed Lot and his family along with the other residents of Sodom and Gomorrah because it was less than 10. But God saves the final, 6 people because of chesed, because of mercy. And so what it's saying is, even Abraham didn't understand the full mercy of God. That's my take on it.
The Talmud, the midrash in the Talmud understands that the reason he didn't go down past 10 was because it's impossible to have a moral position if you don't have a community around you that supports that moral position.
Yeah.
If you don't have what the sociologists call plausibility structures to remind you of what of what it is you believe and to reinforce your own morality. So the lone righteous man in the evil city is a myth, because it's impossible, because soon enough what happens is that the unrighteousness of the city creeps into your own conscience and corrupts your own conscience. I think that's a pretty good argument, actually.
Well, but then why save Lot and his family?
Well, as a favor to Abraham. It's a favorite Abraham. Your business partner's kid, your business partner's nephew is stuck in the city. You're going to go rescue him because he's your business partner. As a favor to Abraham, he goes to rescue him.
I don't know. That's adding a lot there that isn't in the text.
Oh, I like it. I like it.
Okay. I'm saying God wanted Abraham to go lower.
But here's the bigger question is this question, the question about morality. So your claim is that morality is really rooted in God, and that the justice
after the flood.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That the justice that Abraham is appealing to is divine justice, is a sense of divine justice. Okay, is a very credible argument, and I'm suggesting something different. I'm suggesting that there's a sort of innate or natural or different sense, an independent sense of justice. Remember Plato's famous, or Socrates' famous question, is it good because God said it was good, or did God say it was good because it's good, right? Is there an independent sense of goodness, of justice, independent of divine, of God, that Abraham has a sense of, has a connection with, and that's what he's throwing up to God. And you're suggesting that no, this is God's justice that was articulated after the flood.
Yeah, but I'm not disagreeing with your point, and that is what we would call in the Middle Ages, it evolved as natural law.
Right.
Which is that we can know as rational beings what justice is, regardless of the revelations from God. Mm-hmm. That our natural capacities can do that. Yeah, and so there's no contradiction there. It's just, Abraham, what I'm focusing on is why the silence of Noah and why the vociferousness of Abraham.
Well, see, the other contrast that I would draw, and I'll come back to Noah in a moment, but the contrast that I always draw to this story is from the book of Job. Now, that's a book that we Jews don't read very often. In fact, if you ask most Jews, they'll tell you that it's in the New Testament. They don't actually believe that it's in the Old Testament, in our Bible. But if you look at the book of Job is the third book of Ketuvim. It's after Psalms and Proverbs. It's a very strange book. It's a book about a righteous man who suffers terribly. and raises his voice to God and screams, "Why are you doing this to me?" And I find tremendous parallels between Genesis 18, what we just read, and the book of Job. And I'll show you two of them, and I have a suggestion to make. So
Okay.
Job screams out to God, "Why are you doing this to me?" He has neighbors who come to offer explanations. And one of his neighbors says, like, what do you want to do? Take God to court? It's a classic Jewish idea, right? And Job says, "I know I could do this. Man cannot win a suit against God." See, if he insisted on a trial, he wouldn't answer a charge at 1,000. Wise of heart and mighty in power, whoever challenged God and came out whole? Whoever said to him, "What are you doing?"
Well, Abraham did.
That's the point. That's the point. And see, and then he comes back and says, "If I were right, I couldn't speak." And after he goes through this whole exercise about how I couldn't sue God and God wouldn't answer my charges, he ends this speech by saying, "I am blameless. I am distraught. I am sick of life. It is all one. Therefore, I say he destroys the blameless and the guilty." That's the exact opposite of Abraham. Now, here's the really interesting part. Let's go to the very end of the book. Let's fast forward. So what happens at the end of the book, and you'll forgive me for giving away the ending. It's a, if you're planning on reading it, hold your ears for the next moment. But what happens is God shows up after Job has complained for 35 chapters. God shows up in a tempest. God shows up to Elijah in a still small voice. God talks to Joseph in dreams. But when it comes to Job, God shows up in a hurricane. Right? You're living in Florida, you're going to learn about hurricanes, right? And God says from a hurricane, "Who is this who darkens counsel, speaking without knowledge?" God says to Job, "Who are you? Who do you think you are? Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Who do you think you are anyway?" I always think of Robert De Niro in Taxi Driver. "You talking to me? You talking to me? Like, you have any idea who I am? You have no right to challenge me. You have no place to stand to challenge me." And he ends, here's the end of the book, in chapter 42. Job resigns. Job surrenders. "I know you can do everything, that nothing you propose is impossible for you. Who is this who obscures counsel without knowledge? I spoke without understanding of things beyond me, which I didn't know." Here's the end. "Here now I speak. I will ask you, inform me. I had heard you with my ears. Now I see you with my eyes. Therefore I recant and relent, being but dust and ashes." There's only two places in the whole Hebrew Bible where a character says, "I'm only dust and ashes." The end of Job and Genesis 18. And Job says, "I'm only dust and ashes," meaning I give up. I can't ask you questions, God. He assumes Noah's silence. Abraham uses the same phrase ironically. He says, "I know I'm but dust and ashes, but what if the 50 are lacking 5? Can I get 45? Can I get 45? It's an ironic statement. And here's the point I want to make. Job is not really a Jewish story. In fact, the name Job is not a Jewish name. You ever met a Jewish kid named Job? I don't know any Jewish kid named Job. I named kids all kinds of strange names. I've never named a Jewish kid because Job is an Akkadian name. And in the Akkadian, ancient Mesopotamian language, Job means everyone. John Doe. He's the cipher for the common human experience. And the reason God takes him on a tour of the universe is because Job learns of God through nature. That's where Noah learned from God. If nature is your example of divine life, then nature has no mercy, and it certainly has no justice. It doesn't care who you are and what you are. It rains on everybody, or the earthquake destroys everyone, or the hurricane wipes out everyone. And Noah, having learned that idea of God and not the other one, and Job, having learned that idea of God, only assumes a stance of silence and has nothing to say. And the revolution of Abraham is, as you said, to take this notion of justice and to apply it to the world and say, no. I know that nature is your tool, but you can't use it indiscriminately anymore. Now I expect to see justice in the world.
Well, I think that's beautiful and right. I would say, in response to the difference between Noah and Abraham, I would just fall back on Noah ish tzaddik b'dorotav, which is Abraham was better than Noah. He was just a better guy. And he was a smarter guy, and he was more courageous, and he understood the nature of justice more than Noah did. And that phrase that Noah was righteous in his generations, and the rabbis take this up and say, yeah, in another generation, he wouldn't have been so righteous. But so that's how I would leave that. The interesting thing with Job and the comforters who come to him and don't have any helpful advice to him, and I use this all the time because of my, my missionary zeal about life after death, is that the one thing that they could have told Job, the one thing that would have comforted him, they didn't tell him because they didn't have it at that time.
Right.
Which was, Job, you're being punished now because you may have, had some milk and meat together. You may have done some bad things that you aren't even aware of. You're being punished to clear your books. But in the world to come, Job, you're going to be rewarded completely. They don't have that, which it proves a date ad quem in which we know at that point there still is not a world to come, which is exactly right, because that wasn't until the influence of the Greeks and their ideas of matter and form that eventually absorbed into the rabbinic tradition produces the idea of neshama, which is not in the Torah, not in the Tanakh, and that is the idea of a soul, and that's what I learned from Job.
I agree with you. I think that's right. But and Job and Noah are both described by the Bible the same way, as tamim, as men of simple piety, of men of simple and basic decency, we would say. But both of them are attached to nature, and neither one of them has what Abraham has, which is this sense of covenant. They don't have that sense that there is that justice belongs in the world. And I want to stop and just step back from this. Instead of looking at it only as a character, as a literary character, it's a religious universe. To live in Noah's universe, to live in Job's universe, is to adopt an attitude of resignation and acceptance and basic passivity toward the world. So if you see bad things happening in the world, you say, it is what it is. I'm sorry that happened, but there's nothing we do because this is the way of the world. And sometimes, and we're rabbis, we've dealt with people under these circumstances. Sometimes you have to adopt a stance of passivity, of acceptance of what is.
Well, yeah, I would just add the point that you're exactly right, that this notion of justice does not come from nature. I think that's a key point. That's an enormous point. Remember last week, we were talking about how time, or maybe a week before, about how Shabbos, the 7 days, is not in nature. There's nothing in nature that's a week. There's in nature, there's a month, there's a year, but not a week. So the same is true with justice. To quote the great Wordsworth in his poem In Memoriam, nature, how red in tooth and claw. How red in tooth and claw. That is nature. Red in tooth and claw. Full of blood, full of lions eating antelopes, no justice, no mercy, nothing. So the notion of justice that Abraham puts in front of God is a notion that nature cannot support. Now, the great question after the Holocaust and in our own time is, well, if nature doesn't support justice and our religious beliefs are that God wants justice, what if the world doesn't support justice? What if the populated world with all of us in it, and 4,000 years after the revelation to Abraham, what if that world still doesn't have justice in it?
Well, but then the Abraham character is exactly what you need. You need someone who carries a sense of justice, whether he learned it from God or whether it's somehow innate. Nature, looking outside nature doesn't, but is there a deep sense of fairness that we're born with? He has a sense of justice. And what you need, and you carry that sense of justice into the world and insist upon it.
Yeah, but he has someone he can appeal to. He appeals to God. Who do we appeal to?
Right, each other.
We appeal to.
We try to create, this is why you can't live by yourself in the city of Sodom, right? This is why you got to leave Sodom, because if you're the only one in Sodom who has a sense of justice, you too will succumb. You got to create a circle around yourself. And you have to, and look, so this is the difference. Your question is the right question. If you want to live a life of serenity and tranquility, live the life of Job and Noah.
And
Live the
Thoreau,
life of Job.
same thing. Thoreau
Serenity.
had comfort
If
in
you
nature.
want to live, but what you do is you then sit quietly and watch the world. Abraham doesn't know serenity. And I would argue that serenity is not a Jewish value. Like nobody goes to shul for tranquility.
No.
Right? If you have tranquility in your shul, you're in the wrong shul. You should come out with a headache, right? Because it's a place that challenges, it's a place that demands, it's a place that pushes you to grow, it's a place that makes you better, it's a place that tells you you're not good enough, it's not good enough, right? That's why they serve a kiddush when you're done, because you're exhausted from the whole experience, right? But you get one thing out of it. You get a sense of dignity because you stood for what was right. And that's the trade-off. I think that's the trade-off. Now let's take another look. Let's take another story now. At the end of the Parsha, we have another story.
We
And
sure
what's
do.
remarkable is that this story, in some ways, is a completely different religious universe than the one we just read. Completely different religious universe. And everyone knows this story. It's very, very well known. It's just very difficult. It's the story of Akedah Yitzchak. So let's take a look quickly because it's actually
The
remarkably
Isaac, for those.
the binding of Isaac. Sorry, it's remarkably brief in its text. Sometime afterwards, God put Abraham to the test. Now, why it is after all these years he has a test, and why this test, and whether you can study for this test, and whether you can even pass this test, is a great question. There's so many questions in this text. It is the most opaque Bible text, I think it is, of all of them. He said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. Very formal. Take your son, your favorite one, Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering on the heights that I'll point out to you. So early the next morning, Abraham saddled his ass, took with him two servants, and his son Isaac, split the wood, set out for the place God told him. On the third day, he looks up and sees the place, said to the two servants, you stay here, the boy and I will go up, we'll worship and we'll return to you. And he took the wood and put it on his son Isaac, and he took the firestone and the knife, and they walked on together. That phrase is going to repeat itself twice in the story. They did this together. And Isaac says to his father, and here, of course, the question is, how old is Isaac? And in what voice do you hear when you hear this text? Is he a little boy asking with innocence? Is he a teenager asking with adolescent cynicism? Is he a man already asking with faithfulness to and love and respect for his father? Father, he says, yes, my son. Same call and response as we had before. Here are the firestone and the wood. Where is the sheep for the burnt offering? Is that a little boy's question? Why isn't this the normal procedure? Where's the sheep we always bring? Is this the cynicism of the adolescent who says, new pop, are you as crazy as mom says you are? Or is this the man already, the young man who says, Father, I know what we need to do, so let's go get it done. This is their only dialogue. And he says, yes, my son. And he says, God will see to the sheep for his burnt offering, my son. Seeing is an important part of this text. The Torah portion is called Vayera. It's about appearances. And here it ends with this, God will see to the burnt offering, my son. And it says again, the two of them walked off together. They arrive at the place of which God had told him. Abraham built the altar. He bound his son Isaac, laid him on the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife. And all of a sudden, with the knife posed over the boy, the angel shows up and says, Abraham, Abraham. And he says, here I am. And he says, do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you've not withheld your son, your favored one, from me. Abraham looks up and sees the ram. Remember this seeing. And he sees the ram caught in the thicket. And Abraham went and took the ram. And he names the place Adonai Yireh, whence it said, on the mountain of the Lord there's vision. And the angel gives him a blessing at the end because you did this. And at the end, a very curious ending to the story. Remember twice it said, Vayelchu shnechem yachdav, they went up together. Abraham returned to his servants. Really? Where's Isaac? And they departed together for where? Beersheba? But Abraham doesn't live in Beersheba. Abraham lives in Hebron. and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. So here we have a story which is opaque. It's very hard to understand. And the biggest question is, why does God want this man to kill his child? The child he waited a lifetime for, the child born to his mother at the age of 90. Why would God demand this of Abraham? And where is the Abraham that we knew from before? Chutzpah klapei shamaya, divine heavenly chutzpah, arguing with God on behalf of the strangers of Sodom and Gomorrah. Where is the Abraham arguing on behalf of his own son? Where is the justice in all of this? Mark, you wrote a wonderful midrash about this some years ago. Why don't you share that?
Well, I'm a darshan. I'm an interpreter of the Torah. I'm a midrash writer. And in the world of being a darshan, there's a bar mitzvah story, a bat mitzvah story. It means if you want to graduate, a PhD story, you have to weigh in on the Akedah. You have to have a midrash on the Akedah. Otherwise, you're a second-rate darshan, because you have to make sense of this. And I started out, in philosophy, and so I started out really in yeshiva studies, but when I started my philosophy studies, I, of course, read Soren Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling and Sickness Unto Death. And for Kierkegaard, he takes it on its face. He says, the issue of the story is, do you love me? Do you honor me? Abraham, do you honor me, God, more than you honor the independent understanding of the ethical law that you have? And it's not that the ethical law you have is wrong, it's right. But I insist on what Kierkegaard called the teleological suspension of the ethical, meaning what we owe to God, our love for God, transcends even the ethical. So for Kierkegaard, he takes it straight up the throat, and he says, yep, God wants him to kill an innocent kid, and because it's God, you should do it. So I was so revolted by Kierkegaard's interpretation, I wrote a midrash. And it began with my belief that the Torah wouldn't want you to kill an innocent person. And so I looked for clues in the story. And the first clue is the first words, which are badly translated in the text you showed. You have sometimes afterwards, but the Hebrew is Vehi achar hadvarim ha'eleh. And it came to pass after these things. What story do you know in the Torah that begins with a retrospective after these things? So to shorten my midrash, which you can get in Masoret in 92, I wrote it in the 70s, but the story is basically this, and it explains why Abraham didn't say a word. Abraham had agreed with his jealous wife, Sarah, to expel his handmaid, Hagar, and the son that they had together, Abraham and Hagar had, Ishmael, to expel them into the desert because Sarah was jealous of them. And after Isaac was born, she was furiously jealous. The text tries to make it a sin of Hagar, but it isn't. And Abraham's response to sending a woman and a baby into the desert, which is, let's just get clear about this, a request by his wife Sarah to murder Hagar and Ishmael. You send a woman and a baby into the desert, they're going to die. They'll be raped and killed, or just killed, or die of thirst or hunger as wild animals. They're going to die. And the response of Abraham to this ridiculous, horrible, venal request for homicide by his jealous wife Sarah is to say, Vayera hadavar ma'od b'nei Abraham. This thing was bad in his eyes. What? It means he had certain misgivings. Oh, well, I'm sorry. When someone asks me to murder somebody, I don't have any misgivings. The answer is, Get out of my house, get out of my face, get out of my life. The answer is no, absolutely no. But he doesn't say that. And he sort of vacillates. Not sort of, he does vacillate. And then God interrupts his vacillation and says, oh, al yera beinecha. Don't let it be evil in your eyes. Meaning that it isn't really evil. You just think it's evil in your eyes. Do what Sarah tells you to do, because I will make of the boy Ishmael a great nation. And he said, I will make of, but ki b'yitzchak yikareh lechazer. But Isaac will be, through Isaac, your seed will be named, meaning Isaac's going to inherit the covenant. So God had to figure out, wait a minute, this man I'm using as the pillar of a new religion could be a moral creep. He could be a guy who wants to kill the least loved wife and the least loved son, now that he has a best loved son, Isaac, with his best loved wife, Sarah. I have to know what it is. How do you know that? There was only one way for God to know it, only one way. And that was to test Abraham. And that's why the text also has a clue. God tested Abraham. It doesn't say, and God said to Abraham. It's telling you, don't worry about what you're about to hear, which is revolting. It's only a test. God tests Abraham. And the only way he can do it is by asking him to kill his beloved son. And you could see it in the way they draw it out. Take your son. Well, you have two sons, right? Two sons, but it says, take your son. Yechidecha can be the one that is left, not just the one that's alone. And asher ahavta, which can be comparative in Hebrew, meaning the one you loved more. Saying, oh, you should be ashamed of yourself, that you wouldn't even call Ishmael your son, you didn't call Hagar your wife. And so I'm going to ask you to kill Isaac to see if you believe in the promise to Isaac the way you believed in the promise I gave to Ishmael. If you're willing to do that, I know that you trust me, and for whatever reason, you allowed Hagar to be expelled. I saved her, don't worry. The fact of the matter is, you believed in both sides of the promise. And I could go on, but basically that's the midrash, that God had to test Abraham in exactly this way. And that's why Abraham didn't say a word, because Abraham knew that he was morally culpable in agreeing to kill Hagar and Ishmael. And that's why God had to do the test. So as a result of my midrash, for people who think, oh my God, the Akedah is this big moral challenge of the Torah, how can we believe in a God who would ask a father to kill his own son, an innocent boy? The answer is no. It isn't it's not a theological problem. It's not a moral problem. It's not nothing. It's nothing. It's the result of God having no choice because of Abraham's moral vacillation. No choice but to test him in this way.
So what did he learn at the end? What did Abraham learn from this? How did it change Abraham?
The willingness to sacrifice the least loved almost inevitably leads to the sacrifice of the best loved. And that applies to us. I don't want to get into a political thing, but basically, when we're willing to turn our back on people who are politically powerless and homeless and without supporters and without friends, alone in a cruel and harsh world, because we have a warm home and enough food, when we do that, we are betraying God, because we are willing to sacrifice the least loved. And ultimately what happens is, you have rioting, you have this, that, this, and all of this violence comes back to hit you. And that's ultimately, the reason for that is our vacillation at treating the least loved among us.
That's a wonderful midrash. And what's really wonderful about it is if you study all of the stories of Abraham, as I said a moment ago, they follow two lines. There's the line of stories having to do with family, progeny, their future, the family's future. And there's the line that has to do with covenant and all that, and the ethics of covenant. And they oscillate back and forth. First you have one story, then the other. God says, Lech lecha, I want you to follow me into the world. That's the covenant. And then Abraham goes to Egypt and passes off his wife as his sister. That's the family. And then you go back and there's a covenant of the pieces, and then there's Abraham's anxiety, he doesn't have an heir. It goes back and forth, but you brought them together at the end. You brought them together and said what he learns from the family drama is of direct importance to the ultimate ethical, the ultimate moral lesson of covenant. That if you're willing to sacrifice one, you'll end up sacrificing them all. And you have to feel the pain of what you did in order to understand. You have to really internalize it. He had to go up that mountain, and he had to come back alone because he had to feel what he did. No, the coming back alone is very powerful.
Yeah.
He couldn't come back with his kid because he'd done something, now he understood. He lives alone at the end, the sense of being alone. Of course, at the end, of course, he goes to Beersheba, and Hagar is the one who lives in Beersheba. It's a little bit of a scandal because he goes back to the girlfriend, not to the wife. But he goes to find her and make right. In the Islamic sources, that's what he does. In the Muslim midrashim on the Akedah, he goes not to Beersheba, but he goes actually to Mecca, and there he builds a life with Hagar and with Hagar and with Ishmael. So he makes whole the family that he broke. It's a wonderful midrash.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful midrash. Let me just present a different way of looking at the same story because it's too rich a story. And the beauty of a story like this is that it has multiple possibilities. It carries so many multiple possibilities. So here's a slightly different way of reading the story. So I asked the question before, what's the religious universe that's painted by the story of Sodom and Gomorrah? It's a universe of a man who embraces God's justice and stands up for it in the world. Chutzpah klapei shamayim. And then you get to this story, and it would appear that this story is the opposite. In some ways, it's Abraham is experiencing Job's dilemma when the world just doesn't make sense. What you said a moment ago, Mark, what if you stand for justice and there's nobody to talk to? Because God doesn't give him a moment to say, hey, wait a minute, that's my kid. He doesn't even give him the chance to do that. There's is a God who is as opaque as nature is opaque, morally opaque as nature is. And it seems that what happens is that you get in the Akedah, it's the Job situation, only it's Abraham experiencing it. The incredible, cruel injustice of a world that would give you this child and then take it away, and then take it away. And what does Abraham do? He goes along with it. And of course, in the rabbinic tradition, for the most part, the rabbinic tradition praises him because that's how the story ends. Because you were willing to do this, I'll give you all of these blessings. And the rabbinic tradition says to God, because Abraham was so faithful, please be faithful to us. But there was a strain in the rabbinic tradition of the 3rd, 4th, 5th century that was uncomfortable with that was uncomfortable with an Abraham turned to silence, and uncomfortable with an Abraham turned to resignation and surrender. And so you have this remarkable midrash. It's found in a number of different sources. But this one is actually, it's from the Tanchuma, but it's retold in Elie Wiesel's famous book, The Messengers of God. And it refers, I'll show you what it refers to. It refers to one particular line in the story, which I think is important to take a look at. And the line, let me just go up for a moment, if you don't mind. Sorry. Excuse all my sources here. Here's the line in the story, right? So Abraham has the kid up on the altar, and the kid is laying on the altar, and he's bound. That's Akedah, he's bound. And Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son. That's the scene, right? And then the angel of the Lord calls to him from heaven. So who's talking? It's an angel. Abraham, and he says, yep. And he says, do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God. Who's talking? It's the angel. And then, since you've not withheld your son, your favored one, from me. Suddenly, in the middle of that sentence, the speaker changes from the angel to God himself. And that, the midrash said, that's an invitation to interpretation. So here's the invitation. Here's the interpretation. When God sent the angel to restrain Abraham, he refused the call. God himself ordered me to sacrifice my son. It's up to him to rescind the order. I only listen to the boss. I don't listen to underlings. God told me to sacrifice the kid. I'm going to sacrifice the kid. So you get this sense of him pushing the knife down and the angel wrestling the knife out of his arm, which is God wrestling is an old Jewish, wrestling angels is an old Jewish preoccupation. It's a sport. So God shows up to retract the commandment, but Abraham struggles to continue. You listen to me or the kid gets it. With the knife at the throat of his son, he begins to argue. So what have the rabbis done? They insert right into the text the other story, the Abraham of chutzpah. I shall not leave the altar before I speak my mind. God says, speak, just don't touch the kid. Didn't you promise me my descendants would be as numerous as the sky, as the stars in the sky? Yes. And whose descendants? Mine alone? No, Isaac's as well. And didn't you promise me they'd inherit the earth? Yes, I promise you that. And whose descendants? Mine alone? No, said God, they'll be Isaac's. Well then, my Lord, I could have pointed out to you before that your order contradicted your promise. I could have spoken up, but I didn't. I contained my grief and held my tongue. And in return, I want you to make me the following promise, that when in the future my children and children's children throughout the generations act against your law and your will, you will also say nothing and forgive them. And the last line, so be it, God agreed, let them but retell this tale and they will be forgiven. The rabbis of the Tanchuma put the chutzpahdik Abraham back into this story. And they create this idea because they chose to, they would rather live in the religious universe of screaming about justice, even to an empty universe, than to give up the pursuit of justice. And they have Abraham arguing with God, even in that very moment, and of God relenting in the end and offering forgiveness, which is why the story of Akedah Yitzchak, the story of the sacrifice of Isaac, is read on Rosh Hashanah in all traditional synagogues. It's why the traditional synagogues read it. And the question, though, is twofold. Number one, when it says, let them but retell this tale and they will be forgiven, what tale? The tale of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice him? Or the tale of Abraham's argument? Was it reminding God that we will argue for justice under all circumstances? You can't get away with it. Is that what it is? The chutzpah? Reminding God that we are the people of chutzpah? And the second piece is, what ends up happening, and this is Wiesel's great point, is that it's Abraham testing God. Are you a God who wants children? Are you a God who wants to kill rather than bring life? If you're a God of death, we want nothing to do with you. But if you're a God of life, we might have a future together. And that's a very strange and very interesting, in many ways, wonderful post-Holocaust reading of the text.
I really love that. And there's another sidelight to that, because, for the rabbis, this idea that you beautifully just described has a name, which is Zechut Avot. And that idea of theirs was that because of the enormous virtue, primarily of Isaac, because the main switch of the rabbis was to change it from a story about Abraham and his test, which is what my midrash is about, to the virtue of Isaac, because they thought he was 39 and he willingly allowed himself to be sacrificed and so on. But they say because of the enormous virtue of Isaac, more than he needed for his own life, this extra virtue, the zechut of him doing this, when we tell the story, filters down through Isaac to us, and we are redeemed on Yom Kippur, on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, we're redeemed because of the sacrifice of Isaac. Now, let me just say that these rabbis knew about Christianity. They were in that world. And this is as close, this is this close between Christianity and Judaism. This is without them saying Christians got something right, because they couldn't say that. It's them saying listen, Christians got something right. And what they got right was, if we appeal to God on Yom Tov to be forgiven, we're not going to be forgiven. We need help. Christians say, if we want to be saved, we can't be saved. We're sinners. We need the sacrificial death of Jesus. That's their answer. The Jewish answer, the rabbinic answer, is identical, really. Not the same story, but the theological dynamic is exactly the same. We cannot be saved on our own. It's the supervening grace and mitzvahs and the yichud, the connection between us and the zechut of the ancestors that saves us. This is as close as we get.
And of course, what happens is you end up with this very, in many ways, terrifying sort of counter narrative to the other one. I mean, the name for God for Abraham is Magen Avraham, God who is shield of Abraham. The name of God for Isaac is Pachad Yitzchak, the terror of Isaac.
Yeah.
Right? It's a very interesting, it's an interesting religious universe. It's a universe that's very uncomfortable to us as moderns and very difficult. But on the other hand, in some ways, there are moments of life when that's what you feel is present to you. And I, you and I have carried on a wonderful conversation before about martyrdom and Mesiras Nefesh and what one gives up in order to achieve the love of God. It's a very, very powerful question. And we'll have to continue that next week when we talk about a little bit more about Isaac and who Isaac is. So thank you again for joining us. Today we've looked at religious universes, big, big, big questions. And I hope that you've enjoyed this learning together. Thank you, Mark. And let's hope that this next week brings us closer together as a nation, as a community, as a people, and as families. Have a good rest of your Shabbos. Following this Torah study at 10 o'clock, we're going to be live from the synagogue with a wonderful service, a bat mitzvah of Leora Imrani, a wonderful young woman who studied this Parsha very deeply and has important things to say. And following her bat mitzvah this morning, you're all welcome to join us. At 11:30 will be Rabbi Hillel Silverman's thoughts on the Parsha as well. This evening at 6 o'clock, Havdalah. And then during the course of the week, Minyan in the morning, 8:30 on Sunday, 7:30 on weekdays, 5 o'clock this week, all week, 5 o'clock. Lunch and Learn, my Lunch and Learn class on Wednesday afternoons at 12:30. Mitzvah Day is coming up. Mitzvah Day is coming up, so please join us. And do a mitzvah. Look at the VBS website and the VBS emails for all of the mitzvah day information. Doing an act of tzedek, of doing good for the world, will give you strength to get through all of the controversy that we've experienced. I wish you a really good Shabbos. Take good care.
Shabbat shalom.